Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Welcome to this event sponsored by the Center for American Studies and Research. My name is Patrick McGreevy. I'm the director of the center. I wanted to remind you that we have another event next Thursday, November 6th, featuring Aslam Altan Olke from Koç University, who's going to be speaking about cosmopolitanism and education in the Middle East. She's done a lot of research on AUB, AUC, and University of the Bosphorus, and she compares the meaning of those kinds of education within their societies. I might also mention that we have another event scheduled about the elections, which will happen on the 25th of November after the elections are over. And this is a debate between Rami Houri of the Issam Ferris Institute and Michael Young of the Daily Star. And they're going to assess the U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East during the Bush years and during the next administration. So today's event is called Real Change, a forum on the U.S. elections. And it features three AUB professors, Markus Marktanner from the economics department, Karim Makdisi from PSPA, and myself. However, I have to admit that nobody's an expert on this, or I should say everybody's an expert on it because we've been hearing so much about it for an entire year. So we're going to try to get our comments over fairly quickly so we can have a discussion with the audience. It's been an extraordinary election year in the U.S., full of all kinds of precedents, not just the gender and race of the contenders. Both campaigns are now running on the theme of change, and people in the U.S. and indeed all over the world seem eager for change after 8 years of George W. Bush. In the midst of the campaign came an economic shock, the likes of which we haven't seen since 1929, and it was the moment, I think, when the dynamics of the campaign took shape, that is, Obama gained the initiative, and so far at least he hasn't lost it. It reminded me of the anticipation of change that many people expressed in the months leading up to the millennium 8 years ago. Of course, that fizzled, but a year later on September 11th, we did have some dramatic events that have kind of defined much about what is new about the millennium, at least so far. So, with 5 days to go, this panel will address the question of change in the U.S. election, how real and how fundamental is it, and how real and fundamental will it be. Markus Marktanner will begin by speaking for about 10 or 12 minutes on economic change in the election. I will then speak a little bit about political and social change, primarily in the U.S., and Karim Makdisi will then talk about the prospects for change in U.S. foreign policies, particularly in the Middle East. Markus.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. I was once at the conference, and the presenter said that the presentation would be like a women's dress. It should be long enough to cover the subject. Better? Better? Can you hear me? So I just said that I was once at the presentation, and the presenter said a presentation should be like a women's dress. It should be long enough to cover the subject and short enough to stimulate interest. And so the economic situation in election is definitely an interesting cloth, and I hope to be, over the next 10 to 12 minutes, a decent tailor and to get a nice dress together. I have basically two questions here. The first one is, how do economics and politics interact at the moment of economic upheaval today? And probably the more important question is, will there be real change at the international economic policy front after the election? Obviously, what's happening today or these days is a real hype about economics. Everyone is now concerned with Joe the plumber and no longer anymore Osama bin Laden, or what's going on in the mind of Joe the plumber seems to be now more important than what's going on at the war against terrorism, or Taliban in Afghanistan, or economics has simply taken over. And everyone is looking for the election now, and everyone thinks, oh my God, the elections will bring huge change. And although I believe, and although I agree that the current economic change and meltdown is really severe, I also believe that it is politically extremely hyped. I don't think that US economic policy will make a huge difference to the solution of the current crisis. I have basically two main arguments to make. The first one is that the current economic crisis is mainly a political windfall for the Obama campaign. It is not more and it is not less. I believe that the current crisis could well have happened already under the Clinton years, and there is also a good chance that the crisis would have struck after the election. I think it is important to see the much bigger picture of what has been going on in economics over the last 25, 30 years. At least the argument that I'm trying to present is that the origin of today's crisis can be traced back much more than a decade. The second argument is that I'm trying to make, that yes, there will be real change for economic policy, but no, the election will barely make a difference to the outcome of how international economic policy will be affected as the international community will go about to resolve the current crisis. So those are my main arguments, and I try to support those now a little bit more. Again, I believe that the current crisis could have struck earlier, or maybe in a couple of years or so. And in order to support this hypothesis, it is important really to go back to what happened in 1981 when President Reagan was elected president. It was a time when economics and economic policy experienced again a fundamental shift. It was a shift towards what economists call supply-side economics. It was suddenly a strong belief that the only thing that can take care of economic problems are markets, well-functioning markets. The state is supposed to withdraw itself from the playing field and let the market take care of everything. That was the paradigm introduced by Reagan. And the reason for that was the oil crisis and the experience with the oil crisis, when the whole world still sticked to an economic paradigm that was characterized by demand-side economics. The idea during the oil crisis was that one could eventually be able to contain the adverse effects of the oil crisis if the international community coordinates economic policy in terms of fiscal policy and monetary policy. But that didn't work because in the first place, the problem was on the supply side. It was the oil crisis. And for supply-side problems, it takes supply-side policy responses. So in 1981, a real paradigm shift occurred. And many people would actually say that Reaganomics, or the changes that happened with the beginning of the 1980s, were not all that bad. During the 70s, the world economy was growing on an annual rate maybe at 0.5%, and after the 1980s at roughly 3%. So it cannot all be that bad. But as often whenever mankind embarks on a new political paradigm or on a new economic policy endeavor, the devil is in the details. And I think it is important to see the details of the problem and not to challenge the whole system. In order to understand the current financial crisis, I always like to give an example. Economics is essentially like traffic, and the financial system is like the highway. And economic policy is supposed to be like a highway patrol that regulates traffic so that the cars can flow freely and efficiently. And Patrick already compared the current crisis in its dimensions to, for example, the 1929 Great Depression. What happened, for example, during the 1929 Great Depression was that one had deflation, and what happened is that the roads became smaller and smaller, or less, but there were ever more cars, and eventually there was a traffic jam, and the economy came to a standstill simply because there were not enough roads anymore. What happened during the 1970s, during the oil crisis, was more that the cars didn't even drive because nobody had the money to pay for the fuel. What happened with today's crisis is that beginning in the 1980s, everyone suddenly removed the traffic signs and removed the highway patrol and let everyone drive freely. So it invited everyone else to basically speed, to drive drunk, or to even drive without a license. So that is like, if you take the example of the traffic and the highway patrol of economic policy, I think it's very easy to show the differences. And the solution to the current crisis will be very pragmatic. What's going to happen is that international policy coordination, they will erect again traffic signs and stop signs, and what's going to happen is simply to regulate the traffic differently. This is much more subject to pragmatism rather than to ideological differences or party politics. At least this is my assessment of the situation. So I said at the beginning that I strongly believe that the current crisis is mainly a political windfall profit to the Obama campaign. And the crisis could have happened next year, in 2 years, but it also could have already happened several years ago, because there were already early signs that there is something wrong, that there's something wrong with globalization that both Clinton and Bush ignored. And I just want to give some examples. In 1994, there was already the tequila crisis in Mexico, or the peso crisis, which was under the Clinton rule. The 1997 Asian crisis was also under the Clinton rule. I'm not blaming him, and I'm just saying there were already indicators that globalization may have run too hot in earlier days. And then in 2001, there was the Enron crisis, and now in 2008, we have the subprime crisis. What I'm trying to say, I'm not trying to blame anyone or any political party. I'm just trying to create awareness for the fact that for several years, more than a quarter of a century, we have been on a different economic paradigm. And several people have ignored early signs that something may have gone wrong. So that's why I believe that the Obama campaign is simply lucky these days. And it also seems to me that the way I look at the debates, that nobody really seems to blame the other one for the current crisis. The second argument is that the resolution of the current crisis will not depend much on the outcome of the election campaign. Coming back again to the example of the traffic and the roads, one will find very pragmatic solutions. I really don't see where party politics would really come into play at this point of time. You know, Democrats and Republicans will agree if there is a traffic jam at a certain location in a city, you know, one has to erect maybe a traffic light there. And that is what's going to happen. What is much more important is, my biggest concern is actually that the political crisis is eventually, that the current economic crisis is eventually politically abused. And I would like to conclude my presentation with really some personal remarks. So first, I hope that the current crisis is politically not abused in the sense that politicians say suddenly there is something wrong with globalization, and that it would lead eventually to a retreat from globalization. I personally, as a development economist, believe that we have too much financial globalization, but much too little real sector globalization. You know, if you currently observe, for example, the Doha round, when developing countries are trying to gain desperately entrance into the international division of labor, it is the industrialized countries that keep them outside. I think globalization must advance there, but it doesn't necessarily have to advance in financial markets. So I hope that the current economic crisis will not become politically abused one day. And I feel that probably the Obama campaign is more likely to fall for this temptation. But then again, I also have some hopes because Obama has a grandma in Kenya that in case he ever decides to retreat from globalization, that he may get good advice from his grandma in Kenya. The second argument is that what I hope for is that after the election is that the last 50 years of economic policy, of international economic policy, have been predominantly orchestrated by the US. But things have changed a lot. And I think Europe has a real competitive model for economic policy too. There is even things one can learn maybe from the East Asian economies. So what I hope for after the election is really that a dialogue takes place about the future course of economic policy that is more on the same, on a level playing field, on the same height. And I can believe that Obama would be much more likely to hold such a discussion and initiate such a discussion. Those are pretty much my comments on the relationship of economics and politics, and would like to give back again to Patrick. Thank you very much.
I've written some of my comments down. It's the only way to keep myself within 10 minutes. My comments are going to focus on the political and social change in the U.S. But I did want to say that if we look at the stated positions of the two candidates, there really is not a fundamental difference in foreign policy. Obama will end the Iraq War sooner. He will talk to adversaries more. He will use more soft power. But he's not a peace candidate. I mean, he will, in fact, change the field of battle and enhance the battle in Afghanistan and indeed in Pakistan. Both candidates, I think, will continue the U.S. policy that, in a sense, they've inherited from Britain. This is the policy of dominating, or if you prefer, protecting the strategic resources of the Middle East. The only public debate in Washington about this most basic issue is how to do that most effectively, what mix of hard and soft power to employ. So, turning to domestic issues, will there be a change if McCain wins? Not unless he dies in office and Sarah Palin chooses Newt Gingrich or Donald Rumsfeld as her vice president, who then actually rules the country. And then we have a return to the Bush administration circa 2003 on steroids. However, leftists sometimes argue that extreme repressive regimes can lead to popular mobilization, and that in turn can lead to fundamental change. Well, no thanks. I don't need any more extreme regimes myself. But it is worth asking whether Barack Obama would be where he is today if we hadn't had such an extreme regime for the last 8 years. And to the extent that there's a potential for change now, would that potential be there if we hadn't had this last 8 years? Are race and gender dynamics changing in the U.S.? I do think that Hillary Clinton and even Sarah Palin has been damaged by sexist attitudes. I don't think it's been decisive, but I think that they've taken hits about that. Clearly, racist attacks still have a lot of power. Hillary did well in those blue-collar, white working-class areas in the primaries. She famously claimed after the Pennsylvania primary that Obama lacked support among, quote, hardworking Americans, white Americans. And Palin particularly has taken the cue from the long tradition of defining the American national community as white. This includes Nixon's evocation of the silent majority, Reagan's complaints about welfare, and many others. Now, Palin does not explicitly mention race. She just shouts out, as she says, to ordinary, hardworking, everyday Americans like you and me. She doesn't even say, not like him, but she doesn't need to. Now, this still has some power and some appeal in the U.S., just as anti-Catholicism did in 1960. But JFK won that election because it was no longer a decisive thing. It was still there, but it was no longer decisive. And race seems to be losing some of its sticking power today in the U.S. Perhaps because of this economic situation. It seems so dire that how can we worry about race? Perhaps because Obama acts middle class. Some people have called him a debonair Fred Astaire of American politics. Perhaps it's because he evokes less tension in white Americans because his black family is not the descendant of slaves from the U.S., but rather his father is from Africa. Like Colin Powell, he's not a descendant of American slaves. Perhaps it's because the demographics have sufficiently changed in the U.S. This is hard to tell, but in approximately 3 decades, white people will be a minority in the U.S., and perhaps this is already beginning to have an effect. Now, there's one aspect of Obama's success that I find a little bit troubling, and it's the embrace of Obama by some of the most important centers of concentrated wealth and power in the U.S. I'm not only speaking about Obama genuflecting before AIPAC, but the shift of financial support from to his campaign from large financial and pharmaceutical and other centers of power. And some of the advisors he's chosen as well make me wonder about this. Could it be that some of these same centers of concentrated wealth and power, the same ones that have insisted that the U.S. needs to dominate the Middle East, believe that a black president could do this in a particularly effective way? Melanie McAllister has documented the way that U.S. public diplomacy described the American armed forces at the start of the first Gulf War. They were a multicultural microcosm of the U.S. population. General Colin Powell stood for the nation, she writes, not because it was figured as black, but because it was figured as open-minded, multicultural, and pluralist. The U.S. was superior and had the right to hegemony in other parts of the world, particularly because the supposedly less liberal centers or countries in the world, particularly in the Middle East. Saddam Hussein, after all, did not have Asians and women and black in his army. Barnaby Phillips recently wrote, "An Obama victory, in the eyes of some foreigners, does not only grant the United States redemption from the sins of the last 8 years, it also asserts America's right to international leadership." Some people call this multicultural imperialism. You know, the very fact that no other Western country could imagine a black leader gives extra leverage to this possibility. This is perhaps only to say that people are going to be tugging Barack Obama in different directions if he wins. But Barack Obama was once a progressive. I think that's very clear. I know people who knew him 10 years ago, and there was absolutely no doubt about that. And his progressive defenders, and indeed a lot of people I've met in the Middle East, say his change is simply because he's doing what he has to do to get elected. And once he gets in office, he will show his true colors, the way Bush did. Circumstances provided Bush with the opening to do that. And so I guess one of the questions is, do we have circumstances today, a kind of perfect storm of economic crisis and questionable wars overseas that could provide a kind of opportunity that's similar for Obama? Franklin Delano Roosevelt arrived in the White House in 1932 with very few progressive credentials. The 1930s were a time of mobilization, of workers, progressives, the poor. Roosevelt sensed that the nation was ready for fundamental change. He attacked the concentrated wealth that had developed in the economically liberal 1920s, using terms like economic royalists and wars on monopoly. He said that the real crisis was underconsumption because too few people had any money to spend. In short, he created a massive transfer of wealth from elites downward. He created protections for labor like the 8-hour day. He created the welfare state. And on the domestic front, at least, I think these are fundamental changes. Now, we can't be deluded that Barack Obama represents progressive change in himself or in his skin color alone. But the odds may be very great for progressive change, but it's not impossible. Even the USA is a human creation, and power depends to some extent on the hearts and minds of people. And these are hard to predict and hard to control. The only way for Obama to create fundamental change, as Howard Zinn recently put it, is if he is enveloped in a social movement which is angry enough, powerful enough, and militant enough that he fills his abstract phrases about change with real content. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah. In some ways, I'm sorry that my friend and colleague Rami Khouri is not here, because often when I'm on panels with him, he plays the optimist to my pessimist. I'm usually the pessimist, and I'm generally relieved when Rami is around because he tends to be very optimistic and paints a very nice picture. I'm afraid my picture is not very rosy, but what I'll do is based on what Patrick had told me, I'll keep this very short, just make a few remarks, and then I prefer perhaps to go to specific cases. We can go in the Q&A and expand on any particular points. Discussions of specific U.S. foreign policy choices have to be contextualized in the larger political and security debate that is currently consuming U.S. policy and indeed military circles. The candidates' foreign policy thus depends on their perception of the security threat, because it is this perception that will naturally lay the possible policy options that are available. And specifically, the question that we have to ask ourselves today is, do either Obama or McCain differ on how they see the world in security terms, or do they only differ on the mechanism or strategies that ultimately will reach the same or similar objectives? I would argue it's the latter, that In other words, that they differ mostly in terms of the mechanisms and strategies rather than on the underlying basis and how they see the world and the security threats in the world. U.S. policy, particularly since September 11th, since 9/11, has focused on what has been called the long war, which basically reflects the ongoing developments of U.S. strategic thinking since the September 11th attacks. If you go back to the U.S. National Security Strategy of 2002, this articulates this new logic when it says that at the end of the Cold War, I'm quoting now, at the end of the Cold War, our security environment has undergone profound transformation. New deadly challenges have emerged from rogue states and terrorists. None of these contemporary threats rival the sheer destructive power that was arrayed against us by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. However, the nature and motivation of these new adversaries, their determination to obtain destructive powers hitherto available only to the world's strongest states, and the greater likelihood that they will use weapons of mass destruction against us, make today's security environment more complex and dangerous. And this, in various forms, has been repeated over and over again across the political spectrum in the United States. And, for instance, General Pace in 2006 says, "We are at a critical time in the history of this great country and find ourselves challenged in ways we did not expect. We face a ruthless enemy intent on destroying our way of life and an uncertain future." Now, if you consider a Pentagon report that was issued, sort of a well-known Pentagon report that was issued in 2006, it pushes this further, and it says, looking beyond the Iraq and Afghanistan wars that were at that point raging, the U.S. commanders envisioned a war unlimited in time and space against global Islamic extremism. Quote, "The struggle may well be fought in dozens of other countries simultaneously and for many years to come," the report says. The emphasis switches from the large-scale conventional military operations, such as the 2003 invasion of Iraq, towards a rapid deployment of highly mobile, often covert counter-terrorist forces. Now, this is the Bush policy, and this has been the Bush policy over the past several years. So let's examine this and see what's happening today. Just a couple of small examples. If we look at Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Syria. In Pakistan, the Bush administration had recently, I think last year, issued a presidential order authorizing American strikes inside Pakistan without seeking the approval of the Pakistani government. The notion was also extended to the hot pursuit. In other words, if you have an enemy that's crossing borders, you have the right to pursue this enemy into another country and destroy it. This is the Bush policy and has been supported. McCain, of course, would support such a policy. And Obama, perhaps surprising to some, has enthusiastically supported such a policy, particularly in Pakistan. In fact, as many of you probably know, he has shifted and located the main problem today in this area around Pakistan and Afghanistan, and has advocated in increasing the number of attacks, even without Pakistani government approval, if it somehow complies with military and security needs of the United States. The fact that this impact on Pakistan would, as many would argue, would be catastrophic, I think is beside the point, because we have seen that similar kinds of policies that were pursued, for instance, in Lebanon by the Israelis, hasn't deterred or stopped this kind of rationale, which is to say that creating instability and social and economic and political problems within certain countries is let's say a price that the United States is willing to pay as long as it supposedly serves its longer-term interests, security interests. One of the main reasons given for this kind of escalation in Pakistan is to help the US or NATO war in Afghanistan, which has gone disastrously bad. This leads many to think that as part of this long war, strategy, and the battles in Iraq, but also especially in Afghanistan, and this new trying to center it increasingly on Afghanistan and Pakistan, is to shift NATO priorities away from simply the Euro-Atlantic Alliance area to closer to China and well-grounded within Asia itself. This is a major shift. And the fact that Obama would support that tells its own story. If you look at another recent example in Syria, A few days ago, as you know, there was an attack by U.S. helicopters into northern part of Syria, close to the border with Iraq. This was justified by various sources as saying that there was an attack on some Al-Qaeda operative and operatives that were leading to instability in Iraq and providing arms and all sorts of things within Iraq itself. This may or may not be true. We certainly don't know now. The Syrian government has claimed that this is simply civilians that have been killed. Who knows? It could be one or the other. But the particular, what happened in terms of the circumstances are not as important as the principle of extending this notion of being able to pursue enemies into different states without even needing the request of the host governments in a very systematic and programmatic way. This is something, again, that Obama and, of course, McCain support. So is it very different in this terms from the Bush strategies and the Bush policies over the past several years? Well, based on the examples that we see before us today, it seems not so rosy and not such a good picture, unfortunately. What about other areas? If you take the Middle East and this the so-called Middle East peace process, well, again, leaving aside McCain for a moment, because McCain. If I say McCain, I mean disaster. So I'm not going to. I think none of us have much hope for McCain. So let's just focus a little bit on Obama. Bringing Obama in is basically, as far as we can tell, and I hope I'm wrong, but if Obama wins, he will be bringing in some very important capacity, Dennis Ross. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Dennis Ross, and let me just quote a recent interview. I mean, Dennis Ross is the architect of the 1990s peace process, which turned out to be, again, an unmitigated disaster for the Palestinians and for the Arabs and even the Israelis, I would argue. He says in a recent interview, just to give you a hint as to what an Obama administration would bring in terms of being new or not so new in the Middle East peace process, he says, he's sort of paraphrasing his own conversation with Obama, he says, this is a way of saying, look, we're trying to see if there's a way to avoid an Iranian, and this is talking about whether the U.S. should attack Iran or engage Iran as well because it's a threat to Israel. Preventing Iran from going nuclear is a very high priority for him, for Obama, not only because it's such a threat to Israel, but because it's such a threat to the United States. On the question of Israel, I talk about what I saw during his trip to Israel, how I saw his understanding of the relationship with Israel. He would describe it as a commitment of the head and heart. He looks at Israel and sees us as being two countries with common values. But he also looks at Israel and sees whatever threatens Israel also happens to threaten the United States. Now, of course, this is perfectly familiar language and perfectly familiar policies, not just because it's Dennis Ross himself who was saying the same thing when he was in the Clinton administration. He's now parroting the same thing in a potential Obama administration. This leads us to believe that there will not be much of an advance in the Middle East peace process. It'll be more of the same, more of the selecting the kinds of players that they want to talk to and rejecting those kinds of players that they don't want to talk to. I fear that if Dennis Ross does come in with Obama, this would be an extremely negative signal for the Middle East. Just very briefly to close, I'll touch on Iran and Iraq. I'm sure there'll be questions on this, but the issues of Iran and Iraq are obviously extremely important. And yes, there's a certain amount of flexibility that I think Obama will bring to the debates in Iran and Iraq, which will be a significant improvement on both the Bush policy and a potential McCain policy. But I think we should not mistake the pragmatic, let's say they're more pragmatic in nature. So the notion of withdrawing from Iraq eventually is simply a pragmatic, rational response to an utter disaster that has befallen the United States in Iraq. It does not change the core commitment that a U.S. administration under Obama would have in terms of continuing this war on terror or this long war. Same thing with Iran. It's simply a pragmatic, more intelligent and more pragmatic way of saying we will talk, possibly, we might talk to certain leaders in Iran if it suits our interests. It's pragmatic, but it doesn't change the overall way of thinking in terms of the world and the security threats that exist in the world. So I don't, in closing, I don't want to be, let me just say a couple of positive points, which is that when it comes to issues dealing with the security threat in the Middle East and in the wider region that's part of this sort of war on terror or long war, I don't see anything very positive happening or anything new happening in the foreseeable future. What I do see happening, and where something good might, or what something positive might be seen in an Obama administration as opposed to a McCain administration, is that in certain issues not related to the war on terror, there would be, I think, a marked shift. There would be a more multilateral approach, an approach which at least superficially tends to respect international law and international organizations. More so, there would be more collaboration with allies and with partners throughout the world. And there would be an emphasis on social and economic issues and developmental issues, I think, which are, of course, very, very important. But all of those would be under the radar of any kind of security issues. Security will remain the primary issue, and all the fuzzy sort of social economic issues will remain secondary to that. Finally, Obama, I think, would bring a much nicer, much more pleasant tone, a much more congenial tone to the world stage. I think the American electorate, I think the world has certainly had enough, I think, with the way in which the Bush administration has conducted itself on the global stage. And McCain would likely continue this trend.
You just asked me briefly what kind of change I meant?
Yeah, but the change in the foreign policy, for example.
Yes.
In Palestine, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. If there's a change, this means that he will confront the American establishment.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, he would have to. I'm saying it's not absolutely impossible, but as I said, I was a bit pessimistic about foreign policy. I was a little bit more optimistic about domestic policy. As Markus suggested, the Europeans have a very different domestic situation in terms of support for various kinds of economic safety net. So that could be a kind of change. I think you were next.
For the economy, I think there is a big difference between McCain and Obama, because the Republicans usually refuse to have big government, which means no regulation. And the Democrats accept the idea that the government should regulate. And I think this is why the vote went towards Obama rather than McCain at this juncture. For the Professor McGreevy, on the idea of race, I think that when the campaign started over a year ago, the issue of Iraq was overwhelmingly the population was against. And yet this did not show in the contest between McCain and Obama. They were very close due, I think, to the race thing, the fact that they. And to Professor Makdisi, I just wanted to make a comment that the U.S.-Iraq Security Pact includes an item where it says you can enter other countries, which is going against international law.
I guess those were comments, so.
No,
yeah,
I have a reminder, I'm visiting Professor. I want to ask the panel if they think there will be a significant change in internal social and economic policy between McCain and Obama as concerns, for example, welfare, insurance, taxation, or will it just be minor differences?
I think, for instance, there's a difference in tax policy with Obama taxing people who make more than $250,000 a year, upping their taxes and basically lowering everybody else's. However, that is not so drastic, and in fact, we've had a tremendous concentration of wealth, and in fact, this will simply slow it down a little bit. Wealth will continue to concentrate with this tax cut. Perhaps he could be encouraged to go farther in terms of redistributive processes, although it seems like whenever you do that, you get accused of being a socialist. I do think, Obama's healthcare policies, for instance, are nothing like the standards we have in Europe or Canada. But again, perhaps he could be encouraged. I don't think McCain could at all in those directions.
Do you think that he will actually be able to carry out these?
No, I think the only way that will happen is if there is a movement of people who as Howard Zinn says, envelop him and give him the cover and the encouragement to lead change. I think change. People have to make change. It takes a circumstance. It takes luck as well. But that's what I'm afraid has to happen, because otherwise, he's got all these other pressures on him from his advisors and from his financiers, and there has to be some sort of popular pressure on him. That's my feeling. Yes.
Everything you've said is very interesting, but it goes back to the same point, and I would say if you agree with me, basically, the Obama administration put the velvet glove back on the fist. That's it. I mean, we get punched again, but it's just the velvet glove back on, whereas Bush took it off. That's basically it.
Well, if you're referring to at least to foreign policies, let's say, I would say to a certain extent, yes. I mean, I think that it's obviously very difficult to assess what happens to somebody once he's in office, obviously, and you have to wait for the first shock, for the first problem to happen. And sometimes people are pleasantly surprised by how somebody will respond positively to a crisis. Somebody who appears to be weak, somebody who appears not to have much of a policy. If he or she is confronted with a particular crisis, then this could actually force some kind of change, at least from the top down at this point. If all stays as it is, no, I don't think there'll be that much change. I think you're right. I think it's a matter of mechanism, strategies. I mean, you get out of Iraq because that's the clever thing to do. That's the pragmatic thing to do, not because you somehow are changing the way in which you're thinking about the war on terror or the way in which you're discussing security threats in the longer term. It's just an understanding that what Iraq has done is increased the problems for America and not decreased it. So it's the mechanism which is different rather than the underlying problem.
I agree with what you said, but I think the biggest crime that the Bush administration has done is that they killed the American dream, which was the empire's biggest tool and quality, because it blinded the world and got away with murder because there was this dream. And I think the Obama election, even the highest people in power in the States are dreaming of it because it would reinstate American. Black Americans made it, that whole scenario, how it was made, would be reinstated so that people can be seduced and blinded again to American experience.
And that's, just if I may, I think that's a very good point. But what I think what I'm trying to say, or at least one of the points I'm trying to make, is that sometimes, especially in the Middle East, we tend to conflate all these bad things with George Bush. Now, the Bush and the Bush administration is I have no more words to describe them than has been written and talked about over the past several years. But a lot of the policies that we're talking about began during the Clinton administration. If in the trend, it begins in the late 1990s. The attack in Afghanistan, the attack in Kosovo, all these kinds of attacks, the wrapping up and the trying to force a Middle East peace process solution. All this happened in the latter part of the Clinton administration. What Bush did and what the Bush administration did was they simply added to that and just continued the trend and made it a lot more obvious and visible. They weren't as charming as Clinton was. It was Clinton minus the charm, basically, going forward. But it's not. That's why. So when you're going on to an Obama or other, we shouldn't think that just because Bush is leaving, then a lot of these policies are going to change. It's not the person that's that important. It's the structure and the system, and the way in which the security threats are being perceived. That's much more important than who's the head and who's the president, who's not the president. In this case, I would agree very much with Patrick. The absolute only hope is for a bottom-up social change that comes from within the United States. And one would hope that with the financial, political, social crisis coming out, that this would lead to a change. And perhaps, if you want to be extremely optimistic, you would say that Obama coming in is the symbolic, his fact that he's an African-American, he's cut from a different, presumably cut from a different piece of cloth than the others, could begin to change this process. Let's hope that's correct. I'm unfortunately not an optimist about politics.
Robert.
Hi. I have three questions about change. Quick. One is directed to you, Patrick. It's reform. Do you think it can really take place in the United States unless there's some sort of campaign finance reform, mandatory voting, end of the Electoral College? I love to hear people talk about battleground states here and all this gibberish of the American system. Can there really be any change without electoral reform? Professor Makdisi, the question I have to you, you don't think that it's a change that we saw an administration that was engaged in the big lie of sophistry at the level of we got attacked by A, we'll invade B? I don't see the continuity with the Clinton administration, as horrible as Sudan was, as what, so the continuity question, would this not be changed? In spite of Dennis Ross, I think it's a great critique and should put the fear of whatever in all of us. And finally, Reagan, the idea that it would not be a profound break with Reaganism. Reagan began his campaign in 1980 in Philadelphia, Mississippi. He picked the town where 3 civil rights workers were killed, and political liberalization was beginning under Jimmy Carter. The airlines were being deregulated. So, and when Reagan came in, he ended all research on solar power and got rid of it. So, would we not be seeing, thank God, the end of Reaganism, the end of Thatcherism with an Obama administration?
I'll just quickly say something about the Electoral College. You're right, it's absurd. And the problem with the Electoral College is that it's a rural bias. In other words, the people who argue we can't get rid of the Electoral College because then nobody will campaign in Wyoming. They'll spend all their time in New York and Chicago and L.A. Well, that's where the people are. What's wrong with spending the time with the people instead of the mountains? I mean, it's an inherent bias in the system. And campaign finance, I mean, you're absolutely right. This is why, as I said, these entrenched centers of power have so much power. And the money they give to campaigns is, of course, just one little aspect of it, an important one, but the total amount is not that much.
Many of the questions relates.
Wait 1 second.
A couple other good questions. Just to respond very quickly. I mean, you make a good point, and of course, again, is Obama a change? Yes, I mean, you mentioned, as you said, what happened in Sudan with Clinton, where there's a problem going on in Iraq. He attacks a pharmaceutical sort of storage depot. This happens. I mean, what the Bush administration has done, I think it can't get worse. It cannot get worse than what the Bush administration has done so far. And I think Obama, as I said, will improve the way in which it's done, the methods. I mean, he won't be quite as brash. He won't be quite as duplicitous. He won't be quite. It'll be more pragmatic, more intelligent, and will probably include the partners and allies and all this kind of thing a bit more, and the use of international law and international organizations to attain the objectives a lot more. I think but that's a stylistic response rather than a fundamental change. Now, again,
my point was, I didn't make it well, 95, 98%, whether they were right or wrong, of Americans would and did support attacking the people who ostensibly attacked the United States on September 11th. It's been so long ago, and there's been so much fog and smoke. But he probably, Obama, thinks that people still think those are the people who attacked the United States. They're there somewhere.
Yeah, but it's endless. That's the whole point. That's why we call it the long war, because it's an endless, perpetual war, which will take place throughout the world in all sorts of places, and justifies security crises at all times.
Okay, what up?
I agree with Professor Makdisi that it would be naive from an Eastern perspective, to assume that any American president, whether he he or she may be, will bring about any fundamental changes in the basic defining characteristics of American foreign policy, towards the Middle East specifically. But if you look at it from, first there are two questions. First question, what would make the American voter vote as he does? And more importantly, the subject of this panel, supposing Obama comes, what are the implications? The first question, it would be really from the point of view of the image of America, if after all these blunders during the Bush administration and during the campaign, current campaign, Americans were not to elect Obama. And that would really clearly racist, clearly, I think it would be totally catastrophic or scandalous. This doesn't mean that this would be necessarily better or not. Another related point would be how the rest of the world would view not electing Obama. Even whether that would mean that the globalism would be saved, or the fact that electing the American president should no longer be simply exclusively an American prerogative. It might sound contradictory. But given how much influence the United States has on the rest of the world, there should be some sensitivity on the part of the American voter as to how electing one or the other will be perceived in the rest of the world. But without passing judgment on whether the perceptions are right, the attitudes are justified or not, it's a different question. It simply be, again, semi-scandalous from the way it's perceived all over the world, not only in Europe. And that's a very important consideration. Now, another, I think, very important consideration would be the issue of civil liberties. I think the way September 11 was used by a junta who had the plan ready and seized this opportunity and made the ruthless use of insecurity to do things that would have been unthinkable if it weren't for September 11. Now, how does this affect Obama or not? But the playing on the fears of America, security factor, I think is an issue. I don't think that Obama, given his democratic credentials and his background and the rhetoric he's been using, will continue to encroach as severely and as blatantly on civil liberties in the United States in the name of security. That may be naive. I'm not, this is my argument, has nothing to do with the perspective of the Middle East, but from the perspective of the American voter. I think this is really very serious. Anyone who has any understanding to the core values of the United States, the issue of civility, the last 8 years have been disastrous. So Obama cannot but be an improvement. I mean, I can say more. I mean, one last thing is use the term pragmatism. That's not a dirty word. I'd like to say idealism, being taken seriously. But the fact that Obama is the most pragmatic in this respect, he is no peace candidate, you're absolutely right. But at least he's pragmatic. He can handle the complex issues that will arise internationally in a manner as very distinct from the Bush administration.
Just quickly, I mean, I think that if I understood what you're saying, I mean, I think in part it's important again to get past the personal and to understand that what's happened over the past several years is a paradigm shift in terms of the way in which security is perceived, and it's not just a question of the United States. All over Europe, they've been clamping down on civil rights and freedoms, not to the extent of America perhaps, but it's moving in this direction. In Lebanon, in Syria, and all the countries in the world, in most countries in the world, I should say, at least there's a tremendous amount of legitimacy now being given to governments and to security apparatuses, domestic and local, regional, whatever, to move away from this notion that there are freedoms that are enshrined in sort of human rights and this kind of thing. we're moving away from it. I mean, if you look at the Lebanese laws, people are being thrown in prison, nobody cares. Syria is the same. In America, it's the same. I mean, it's not just a question of moving from one U.S. president to another. There are systems in place, and there's a lot larger complex which has to be analyzed, and not just a shift at the very top of one mountaintop. I think that is important. So that's why I'm saying, in some sense, stylistically, he'll be more eloquent in his defense of civil rights, but whether he'll be able to actually stop this trend is more up to what Patrick is saying in terms of having a social change, which he will be happy to ride. But without that social change coming from the bottom, he's not going to take the lead in pushing it. He has to ride it. And this is where the optimistic part comes in, which is that I think Obama, unlike McCain, would be a lot more likely to ride, he'd be happy to ride the wave of social change, which would be progressive in nature. But I think he's too weak, and I think he's become too much in the system, and he's become blinded by power to actually lead into a new era. That's my own understanding so far.
You were next.
My question is, you introduced the concept of new paradigm introduced by Reagan, which is the market to control more. The market takes care of everything. And you led that to the roots of the economical crisis happening now in the United States. So, helping the election, Obama in his election. To what extent this market take care of everything will dominate to will lead to the financial crisis, the economic crisis, and to what extent this economical crisis helped Obama in his elections? Thank you.
Actually, at this occasion, I can answer also your question, which was whether I'm looking forward to see the end of Reaganomics. And actually, I do. I'm thankful for Reaganomics because I think, the fact of the matter is during the 70s, the world economy was growing at 0.5% between 1980 until today, on average 3%. So I think growing at 3% is better than growing at 0.5%. But of course, I would like to avoid crises like the subprime crisis. And I think, I don't want to go into the details how it came about, but it is basically the lack of regulatory oversight. I believe, I'm a German, I'm a European. I, for example, believe that the social market economy is a much better concept than a purely liberal economic system where the state is standing outside the playing field. I rather like to see a state in the playing field who has like the role of a referee and sometimes uses his whistle in order to stop the game and say, look, we have to, change a player here or there. So I'm looking forward to the end of Reaganomics as much as I was looking forward to the end of Keynesian economics. But I don't know, could I answer your question? Because actually I didn't really get the actual question. Are you happy with what I said?
Yes, I'm writing, yes. I'm taking notes. My question is, to what extent this market takes everything led to the crisis? Why? Because is that because the government has less role, so that led to like a huge impact, a huge disastrous impact on the American economy. That less government on more market made this disastrous change or disastrous effect.
Well, just in a nutshell, what happened is really that housing prices have been going up, and already Clinton wrote in 1994 a letter to the Congress that housing projects should be promoted, and banks thought, since housing prices go up and up and up, let's build houses because we have the house at least as collateral. So there was not really a risk in investing in houses, but then eventually housing prices came down and the crisis was complete. So, and there was a lack of regulatory oversight.
Comment on and agree with what Professor Makdisi said. If we all watch what's going on and the attacks on Obama from the Republicans, Palin and McCain and the others, we would notice that the only attack on Obama is not on how he's going to conduct his war against terrorism or his foreign policy towards the Middle East or otherwise. The attack is mainly on whether he's going to turn socialist or not. They're already accusing him of being a socialist, reminding him of McCarthy and so on and so forth. So I believe that it is true. America is not going to go through through a big change concerning foreign policy. But definitely, Obama has to make some change in the economy, and there has to be. And probably it will come from bottom up, because this is what people have been talking about all the time.
Karim just suggested to me, in the interest of balance, that we should solicit a question from a right-wing person. Conservative.
Can we send out for one?
Well, I'm a registered Republican, and I sent in my write-in ballot for the first time because I'm 18, and I voted for Obama and Biden.
Yes.
Until very recently, I was working at a university in the U.S., in the middle of the U.S., near St. Louis, Missouri, and everyone saw the pictures of St. Louis when 100,000 people came out to see Obama speak. I would just say that among the undergraduates that I was working with, I could really see a lot of enthusiasm for this election. First-time voters, folks that were disillusioned, had come of age after 9/11. The incredible enthusiasm for this candidate. Obama is not going to get off easy. If he lets those folks down, he's going to hear from them. So I think you're going to see some social change in America. At least I'm hopeful.
Well, they're angry about it not being liked. They're angry about their votes, but they don't like not being liked.
Perhaps. Yes, you.
Just to stand up a little bit for old man McCain. Jordan Plummer has described him as a red American. Here I want to maybe shift to another point. How is racism affecting the American elections? Although a black man has reached like the American dream, as she said, but will racism affect the voting? Will people vote to McCain because he's white?
Yes, I think some people will, but we don't know for sure how many people will vote on this basis. Apparently, polls say only about 6% of people say that they will vote on that basis, but they could be doing it in a more subconscious way without saying it. That's hard to say, But as I was arguing before, it looks as if this issue is no longer the issue that kills you. I mean, and when we look back to the Dukakis versus George Bush's father, you could see how race just turned that right around. And I think, security has become an issue, as Karim said. It was just a few days before the last election in 2004 when Osama bin Laden released a tape, and that seemed to help Bush.
In Lebanon, we had a thought that maybe Democrats will bring some change maybe to us as Muslims or as Arabs. But as we are all talking about, change won't just pop out during these elections. It will be all the same system, just maybe in different faces. So no change whatsoever will happen to us. It's not related to us as Arabs or as Muslims. The system will keep on running the same way it has been always been.
Just if I may, just two comments, I think, because there were two very good points. One, in terms of the hope, and yes, I mean, I actually was in Houston when the Democratic primaries were taking place, and I attended in Obama just to see it, to go in and see. And my friends tell me, don't drink from the Kool-Aid, which apparently I did a little bit, because I mean, it is infectious when you're in these things, and the guy is charming and he is charismatic, and he has a certain glow about him. This is true, and I'm a skeptic, as you might have noticed. But I mean, he definitely has a vibe about him. And I would hope that younger people especially would hold him accountable. The question is, how are they going to hold him accountable? 1-2 years later, he's going to start campaigning. If he wins, he'll be campaigning for a second election. You think he's going to not want to take money from the big corporations and from the arms dealers and all these different things? Let's see. And I really hope that you're right and I'm wrong on this. And in terms of Lebanon, let me just say one quick comment. Palestine, Lebanon, Iraq, all these countries, at a certain point have to stop looking at U.S. foreign policy and start looking at their own policies and start figuring out intelligent, rational ways to sort out our own societies and stop having to rely on people on the outside. I think that's a key issue.
from the middle class to the wealthiest class in the United States. And lately, in the late months, we're hearing a lot of accusations about the Democratic Party by the Republicans that the Democratic Party is shifting America from a center-right nation to a leftist nation. To what extent is that tax policy a socialist policy, if it is in any way?
But I'm actually extremely thankful for this question because I had it in my notes, but I overlooked it. I think, first of all, if you look at the last 50 years in the US, that, for example, factors like income inequality have been constantly deteriorating. So the American society has become ever more unequal. And even the growth in the 80s were mostly falling on the rich. And when it comes to tax policy, I personally believe, and I probably would rather classify myself as a rather conservative person rather than a liberal one, but I think the difference between a socialist and a conservative is not if a socialist prefers more or less state. I personally believe there is a role for the state. I think the difference between a socialist and a conservative is much more what do you do with the money that you collect in terms of taxes. I think a socialist is one who simply spends it for consumption, like the Hugo Chavez kind of redistribution style, whereas the conservative approach is you have to have a strong state, but you have to invest heavily, let's say, in public infrastructure, in access to economic opportunities, that people get good education. I think people should have health care. Economic analysis is very clear about market failure in healthcare systems. And from what I hear in domestic policy, I can affiliate much more with Obama policies. I think that is the right way to do. I'm a little bit more skeptical when it comes to international economics. But domestically, I think he is rather approaching or moving the US closer to the European kind of model, which is not really socialist. You have conservative people in Europe too that favor the welfare state.
I just wanted to pick up where you just in the election, where does the idea of international economics fit in, and what would happen under the King or Obama with what's becoming the unholy trinity, the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO? What does that mean for global development?
Yeah, as I said before, I don't think that it really touches on the election campaign. As I said, Obama can just be lucky that the crisis happened. I think it gives him the opportunity to profile himself as a leader, and he does so much better than McCain. I think he has better political advice. But for international economics, the problem is too pragmatic for it to leave any room for ideological dispute. So I don't see, the problem is really like, you have to put up traffic lights, period. We all agree on that. That's not really a fundamental political question. The fundamental political differences play much more a role in domestic policies. Yeah.
Okay, maybe this should be the last question. Dr. Marley.
Paul Krugman, writing in the current issue of Fortune magazine, has an essay entitled, "What Could Obama Do?" which everybody should take a look at. It points out that government spending is 27 or 29% of American gross national product, and that by ending the war in Iraq, Obama could get 2% of it back. By canceling major weapons systems, he could get 1% of it back. But he'd still need 5% to have a national medical policy. He doesn't have a lot of room to maneuver. It gets us back to the stunning realization that almost 3/4 of the American economy is consumer spending. It's people going out and buying stuff, which leads to the second thing I'd like to say is that none of you seem to realize how inward-looking and really neo-isolationist the United States is right now. People are not talking about Afghanistan, Iraq, Sudan. They're talking about the guy down the street lost his house. Am I going to lose my house next? They're cutting back where I work. We don't have medical care. They are very inward-looking in the United States right now. I would be worried about an isolationist foreign policy coming out of the United States, because that's what all these young people are worried about. They don't want to get drafted and go fight someplace. very scared right now, and it's very much concentrated on itself. And I really don't think there's much homegrown momentum to do anything outside the United States. Thank goodness the Mexicans are going back. That's the way to feel. Thank you.
I want to thank all of you for coming today.